Hi Damai, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I really hope are a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant and Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, enjoyable, affordable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the inspiring people I've met about what needs to change if we're to have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm excited to be talking with Mike Casey, an innovator and entrepreneur working on smart food systems and smart energy systems at the same time. Mike will undoubtedly tell you his story in his own words, but by way of a brief introduction, he owns Forest Lodge, the world's first 100% electric, zero fossil fuel orchard here in the heart of central Otago, where we're recording this podcast. He's also CEO of Rewiring Aotearoa, a charity building an electrified future for kiwis. And I'm really interested to hear from Mike about both of those hats he wears. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Mike, thank you for giving up some of your valuable time for it this morning.
Not at all. And Roger, welcome to my home. Welcome to Central Otago.
Thanks very much. Really enjoying it here. So I think before we get started, people are interested in people, and it would be good to learn a bit more about you and your journey to owning a fossil fuel-free cherry orchard and running a charity.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Wellington. I was a suburban boy in Wellington, went to Wellington College, then went to Victoria University and got a degree in computer science. Very soon after that, I left New Zealand to co-found a startup called Grad Connection in Sydney. It was a website for university students looking for their first job. Not particularly deep tech or anything special about the technology, but after 12 years, 4 out of 5 university students in Australia used it to find their first job, and we were acquired by Seek in 2019. I had a couple of other successful organisations I founded in Sydney as well, but Grad Connection was the one that ultimately ended up in the payday for me and my family. And soon after that, we decided, Rebecca, my wife, and I decided to move our 2 young kids at the time. We now have 3 back to New Zealand to start the next chapter of our lives. And just so happened when we were looking for places to buy in the Wanaka, Queenstown region, we always came back pretty much every year for a ski trip to this region. So we were looking for sort of places in Queenstown, Arrowtown, Wanaka, that kind of thing. And lo and behold, found this farm that we're currently sitting at today with the ideal house that we were looking for, with 9 hectares of vacant land for the same price as a 4-bedroom house in Wanaka. So the standing joke is I'm an entrepreneur who loves an opportunity, and my wife's an accountant who loves a bargain. And it wasn't too long before we became members, the newest members of the New Zealand primary sector, and started to adapt into a what we'd now call a rural New Zealand lifestyle, which has just been absolutely fantastic and incredibly rewarding. But I couldn't rest on my laurels of just sitting on 9 hectares of vacant land. I think when we bought the place, there was a lucerne paddock and a few sheep running on this land, and I think the yield on the land might have been under 0.5% in terms of the value, which just wasn't where we wanted to be. And after a bit of research, realised that cherries was a really awesome opportunity. So planted 9,300 cherry trees, which is 25 kilometres of cherry trees, and at the same time brought my love of technology to the fold. And I think the big thing there was being very climate conscious by that point, figuring out how it is that we could run this farm with nothing but electricity, clean electricity from New Zealand's national grid, and stuff that we did ourselves. And 5 years of journey later, I now have Roger at my place, which is super exciting, learning about the 21 electric machines that runs our fully electric farm, which I think is the first fully electric farm in the world.
It's an extraordinary story, and seriously, that's 5 years from woe to go.
It's it. 5 years, 2019. My wife and I and our 2 young kids were over in Tokyo for the Rugby World Cup. And the trees were being planted by a contractor at that time, and so we came back with 9,300 cherry trees in the ground and a home, and trying to figure out how it was that we were going to actually grow cherries, because the thing in all of this is we had no experience in farming at all prior to this endeavour.
So I'm really interested in how you got the necessary information and confidence to go down this route? Because it's obviously an enormous investment of money and time. Yeah, how did you get started on that?
Well, it's an absurd level of naivety, I think, is the way that I would answer that question. Is my wife and I, Rebecca, had enough capital from the sale of our business that we didn't have to ask anyone else's permission to go ahead and do this. There was no going to the banks to ask for this money. We could just go out and do it. And I think that was the one clear advantage that we had. And then it was an overarching desire to build a business that was right for the climate. But I think, if we had done our analysis with any form of discipline, we probably would have talked ourselves out of doing anything. And so really it was just taking a punt on this technology and then retrospectively doing the numbers and actually working out from there how much of an impact electrification now has on the operational costs of our farm, and just realizing how significant that was. So I think the answer in all of this is that people often think that I sort of pre-planned this, and in actual fact that wasn't the case at all. And I think if I would never be hired into a job where I had any form of discipline in what it was that we were doing, because half of entrepreneurship is creating new stuff and just being bold enough to create new stuff. And so that's the sort of approach we took to this farm.
And I wanted to explore that a bit more in terms of whether it was always your intention for this to be a fully electrified operation. You've alluded to your interest in it being positive for the climate, which is great and makes your story such a good fit to this podcast series. But was it always your intention to go fully electric?
It was. Just to step through the way this developed, and I think the answer is, I have a hard time remembering when exactly the time was that we decided that we were going to go fully electric. But when we bought this property, it had a really clunky old diesel irrigation pump. And I remember looking at the sky of Central Otago on this beautiful sunny day and just thinking, well, this just seems stupid to, dig up fossil fuels in Saudi Arabia, ship them all the way to Singapore to refine them, then bring them all the way to New Zealand, and then put them in a pump, and then make me tow a trailer down to the pump to collect that diesel, bring it back and store it in a tank just so I could run my irrigation. To me, it just seems so inefficient when I could install an electric irrigation pump and power that off the Central Otago sun, which is just amazing. And so we built that system. And when we built that system, I sort of started to get an experience around how it was that I could run a solar and battery setup with an irrigation pump. And this was an off-grid system at the time. And it just seemed that it worked really well about 85% of the time. But there was some times where we really needed to water our trees, and it had been overcast for a few days and we didn't have enough power in our batteries to be able to do that. So that made me upgrade our grid connection, and then all of a sudden I had this hybrid grid plus generation storage system available at my disposal. And when I went down that path, it was like I started to think about all of the other machines on our farm that we could begin to electrify. I see the grid as an incredible resource that we have available, because it covers that 15% of the time that you can't self-generate and you can't self-store. But at the same time, solar panels and batteries on my farm means that we get the cheapest average cost of electricity, say per kilowatt hour, than we would if we'd just been buying it from the grid. So they just worked really, really well together. And then came the electric frost fighting fans, and then came the electric vehicles, and then finally came the electric tractor in 2022. And that was pretty much it. By the time I look back on it now, which was, probably 2022, 2023, we had 21 electric machines and not a single drop of diesel or gas was burnt. That included retrofitting the whole house as well. And then just looking back on the numbers now and just realizing, there's $40,000 of energy costs we save a year on a farm that in a good season might make $300,000 of profit. You can sort of see just how significant that opportunity is for the rest of the primary sector of New Zealand.
I think it's personally for me a very encouraging journey, because you can get the impression initiatives like this are really carefully planned right from the word go, and you've taken a bit more of a kind of emergent approach, seeing what works and building on that, and that seems practical and encouraging, and making it more accessible to other people to have a go.
And I think the biggest discovery in all of this was the amount of money that we saved could easily have serviced the finance on the original capital expense. Even at market interest rates, it's quite an incredible amount of savings, and just realizing that really part of this journey now is around figuring out how to make the finance available. How do you pay for finance costs with future savings from the removal of fossil fuels from your life? And this is both at the household level, this is at the farm level, this is at the small business level. And if we can crack that nut, we're going to see the electrification of New Zealand happen really, really quickly. And so that's sort of where one of my key passions now lies.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to exploring that in a few minutes and understanding more what you're doing in that role with Rewiring Aotearoa. I have a strong professional and personal interest in that. But before we move on from the cherries, one of the things you mentioned a few moments ago was the ridiculous situation where we're importing oil and shipping it around in order to be able to drive your original irrigation pump. Of course, the kind of elephant in the room with us as an exporting nation is the carbon associated with getting our products overseas, and in particular a perishable good like cherries, which has to be air freighted out. I'm just interested in your views on that, given that you've worked so hard to eliminate emissions as far as you possibly can from every other part of the operation.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it's something that for a long time almost convinced me not to go down this path, which was, what's the point in electrifying my cherry orchard if I just put everything on a fossil fuel plane and freight it to Taiwan and Shanghai? But it also made me realize that I think a lot of the times the way we think about decarbonisation isn't efficient. And so one of the key things is, you're a business, you look at your pie chart, your individual pie chart, which shows where all your different emissions come from. And then we spend all this time, in the sustainability field of trying to figure out how to, shift the segments of that pie chart down and ultimately shrink that pie chart. But actually, when you look at it, about 50% of New Zealand's emissions are what we call our trade emissions, which are emissions created from, in my case, shipping stuff overseas, but also the emissions created from all the products that are eventually exported overseas. And the other 50% are our domestic emissions, which are the emissions that underpin our lifestyles. And those emissions are namely fossil fuel machines. And so what it made me realize is actually we need to think about sequencing our emissions better. There are emissions that are much harder for us to eliminate immediately. And don't get me wrong, we do need to figure out how to significantly reduce those emissions. But there might not be the technology there. We might have to go through intergenerational change in terms of land use. We might have to do a lot of molding of our economy in order to figure out how to reduce those emissions. But then there's all these emissions that are available to be reduced right now, where technology exists right now. And the big win-win in all of this is that you will probably save a lot of money by reducing those emissions. And those are all the small fossil fuel machines in our households, our farms, our small businesses, those kinds of things. And so it made me realize, actually, my big role of electrifying my farm is not around reducing the emissions of our trade emissions. It's actually reducing our domestic emissions, because if I can prove a business can run effectively on nothing but electricity and is a better business for it because it's more profitable, then we can help to decarbonise all of the households and homes of New Zealand. So I kind of look at it that way. At the end of it, international aviation is going to be something that's going to take a long, long time to decarbonise, and it's not really the responsibility of me as a farmer to figure out how to do this. And that's something that Air New Zealand and the other airlines have to figure out with sustainable aviation fuel. I don't have a role to play in that decarbonisation journey, but I do have a role to play in figuring out how to decarbonise the emissions on the farm, small businesses, and indeed in households. And so that's where I really see the role of my business, is to prove to everyone that electrification is possible, is more efficient and more profitable.
Thanks for that. Makes a great deal of sense to me, and that imperative for those of us that can to take the steps that we can to decarbonise our homes and our workplaces. One of the reasons it makes sense for me is not just from a mitigating climate change perspective, but also from a resilience perspective, because going back to the question of shipping, and a few moments ago when we were walking around your marvellous orchard here, you were saying about 40% of global shipping is related to moving fossil fuels around.
That's right.
And so we have the potential in New Zealand, with a largely renewable grid already, to kind of extract ourselves from that kind of market to a large extent if we can accelerate this process of...
Well, I'll go one step further, and I firmly believe New Zealand is probably in the pole position to be the world's first fully electric economy. Now, that doesn't mean that we've completely eliminated fossil fuels, but what it does mean is our economy won't collapse if those ships stop coming. And I think we could do that very, very quickly, because the large majority of the machines that drive our economy are already able to be replaced with electric technology. We do have fantastic renewable resources, and we have the unique ability now through the introduction of new technology available to the customer to do a lot of generation and storage ourselves. And so that's just a remarkable opportunity for New Zealand, and something that I'm really, really conscious that we try and figure out how to resolve, because it will create a more productive economy, and our resilience will improve, and in general we're just going to be better off as a country. So when you look at my farm, for example, if there was a big earthquake that happened, the AF8 that could go off here at any moment, that's not just power lines going down, that's every road in this region falling into a river or a lake, right? And at that point, there's not going to be a supply of any form of fossil fuels, let alone electricity. The ability for my farm to generate that electricity and store it in batteries, I don't think I could claim that we could run in fifth gear while there is a major disaster like that happening, but we could probably continue to run in second gear while we wait for the infrastructure to be repaired and rebuilt. So turning it from a humanitarian disaster like what we saw with Cyclone Gabrielle and into an infrastructure disaster is one of the first things that this technology is going to allow us to achieve. The second thing is just the sheer economic savings. Like when you look at what New Zealanders spend on fossil fuels at the pump every day, well, I used to think $20 billion was a big figure, right? But actually that's $40 million a day. And the majority of that money will end up flowing overseas to either the refiners overseas that refine the crude oil, or back to the original producers of that crude oil. And so that's quite a remarkable thing as well. When you ask yourself, what would New Zealand do with a $20 million a day pay rise? That's the money that stays in our businesses and in our homes. That is a remarkable opportunity that we need to really be grasping with. So all in all, resilience and economics plus the reduction of emissions, win, win, win.
Completely agree. We do need to talk a bit more about tractors, though, because the dependence of the primary sector on liquid fuels, and particularly diesel, is partly because there aren't the big bits of kit yet that you can run without liquid fuels. What are your thoughts on the future there?
Oh, so quite simply put, you need the right tool for the right job. And I don't want any farmer to become less productive, right? Because this is an economic argument now. Purely and simple, you should be able to run a better business with electricity if the tools exist for the job. Right now, I have a 50 horsepower electric tractor, which can do anything an 80 horsepower diesel tractor can do. And that tractor is absolutely sufficient for doing orchard operations, absolutely sufficient for doing viticulture operations. It gets about 10 hours of operations per charge, and realistically changing behavior slightly on the farm creates a huge amount of, a significant amount of energy savings by doing that. I have seen a 160 horsepower electric tractor in San Francisco when we were over there to pick up our Monarch tractor. So those tractors are coming. And I think the important thing here is that I'm not trying to advise people to electrify their lives straight away. What we want to do is attack the next machine decision that you're making in your home or your business. Now, when you look at that, as long as you understand the economics of electricity, especially when you generate it on your roof and how cheap it is, and we can go into that in a moment, all of a sudden you're going to be looking for an electric machine just because the economics stacks up for you to buy an electric machine next. And so then it really becomes, well, is that electric machine available? As long as we get people doing the numbers, we're going to see a mass acceleration of the electrification of New Zealand.
And the Monarch that you mentioned isn't your first foray into electric tractors, is it? Do you want to tell listeners a bit about your...
Yeah, well, so the Monarch... you know what it's like in manufacturing startups. They told us, I think originally it was going to be ready in 2021, and I don't think we picked it up until, 2020. And I don't actually think we went over and saw it until 2020, and it didn't arrive until 2022, I think. So that was a significant amount of time that we had to figure out how to electrify everything, because at that point I was so convinced that electrification was the way forward. Luckily, and this is the thing that we need to be celebrating, as the nerds of New Zealand, I found one, and he's a chap that you know as well. He's Duncan Aiken, and he runs a startup called Loxley Innovation, and he had converted a tiny little 18 horsepower tractor to electric. It was an Izeki 318, and we essentially leased that off him for probably 18 months to 2 years while we waited for our Monarch to arrive. And that was a really significant thing for us, because it allowed us to build our electric foliage sprayer using that tractor. It allowed us to claim that we were fully electric a lot earlier. Most importantly of all, we didn't have to buy a diesel tractor. So big shout out to him. New Zealand needs to, encourage more nerds out there to do cool stuff. He built that tractor not because he thought it would be commercial. He built that tractor out of his love of electrifying things. And it just so happened at the time a cherry farmer from Central Otago was really interested in electrifying his whole orchard, and we just found each other, and it went from there.
And at home, my wife and I, Melissa and I, actually borrowed that Izeki converted tractor after you and used it for about 6 weeks on our 8-hectare lifestyle block and found it enormously useful. And so Duncan and the other folk at Loxley Innovation are now in the process of converting Kubota to electric for us. So we share something else there in common, Mike.
Such a cool story, and the fact that, when you look at New Zealand's electric history, we have some remarkable history behind us. Modern geothermal was pretty much developed here in New Zealand. We had the world's first fully electric home, the world's second ever electric public streetlights, the world's second ever transmission line. We've now got the world's first electric cherry orchard. That tractor would have been one of the first electric tractors in the world. Not only that, the foliage sprayer that we developed with that electric tractor, 2 of those foliage sprayers have now been exported through TRS Wholesale overseas to Monarch tractor clients. So we're creating quite a little industry here, and I think there's a really awesome opportunity for New Zealand to change its narrative to being a leader in the electrification of everything. When we talk about our food and our exports, and we talk about our tourism, I think that is the real opportunity New Zealand has in front of it, is to be the world's first fully electric economy.
Yeah, and there are so many directions we could take this conversation in, and I'd very much like to. And one of them is the issue of efficiency. And again, when we were walking around your orchard, you were telling me about some of the efficiency differences between engines that run on liquid fuels and using electricity to power the same equipment. And perhaps we'll come back to that in a second. But I agree very much with you that there's a huge opportunity here for New Zealand, and perhaps we'll come on to some more of that when we start talking about Rewiring Aotearoa. But just before we leave your wonderful orchard, what next for Forest Lodge?
Well, so Forest Lodge is now fully electric, and this year we'll hit full production for the first time. So when we planted our trees, that was 2019, taken 5 years, 6 summers to grow up to being now at full production. So last year we made a small profit off 50 tonnes of cherries. This year we're expecting 80 tonnes of cherries to come off the trees. And really the next step now is to become the most profitable fruit growing operation in New Zealand by hectare. And once we've achieved that, and achieved that through energy, that's going to be the final, I think, illustration of just how awesome this opportunity is for the rest of the primary sector and for New Zealand as a whole. And it's just publishing all our numbers, being incredibly transparent, understanding what the upfront capital cost was versus the long-term operational savings, and really just driving that home. So yeah, not scaling. I think one of the problems I've seen in New Zealand is that people scale beyond their capabilities, and that causes all sorts of issues in the primary sector. So I don't want to scale any further. Now it's about proving to the rest of New Zealand that this is the way to go.
And I think just on that issue of a kind of transparency and honesty and being upfront, you've done an awesome job with that. And I wonder if one of the reasons you have so many interested visitors, I think you were saying 12,000 in the last 12 months have come to Forest Lodge to see what you're doing here with the electrification. I wonder if one of the reasons for that is because you are so upfront about the upsides and the downsides and particularly the economic aspects of it.
Well, yeah, I think it's probably 12,000 over maybe 3 years, okay, rather than 1 year. But in actual fact, we've never kept a logbook, so that's just a very rough guess by looking back through calendars and trying to remember how many people. Either way, it's a lot. The narrative's the same regardless of how many people it actually was. But I think the answer is that people are genuinely very curious, and farmers are very curious people. And the best farmers are the ones that use the smallest amount of inputs for the largest amount of outputs, right? And energy is a clear way now that we can reduce our farm input costs while also increasing the profitability of our farms. So I'd say that would be the number one thing. I think we always get big tour groups coming, and there's always some guy that has his arms folded with a bit of a frown on his face, and I always single them out. And I'm like, hey, you look like you're a bit of a skeptic, always in a fun way. And they will always, acknowledge and say, yes, they are. And I said, right, well, you're going to give me a rating out of 10 at the end of this tour, and your opinion is the only one that truly matters, right? And every time it's 8 out of 10, right? They leave excited and happy, not because I'm telling them that the way that they farm is wrong, but just showing them that the way that I farm could have benefits for the way that they farm. And so it's not about telling people what to do, and I think that's a really important thing. A big mistake that we've made in the climate movement is we shouldn't be telling people what to do. We should be showing them a better way. And what's exciting about climate action moving forward is the better way is also the better economic way. And so I spend very, very little time talking about emissions now and all about talking about money. At the end of the day, the win-win is it doesn't matter if you're doing it for the balance sheet or you're doing it for the environment, both win.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting example for me, what you're doing here of, in practice, what the IPCC have said, which is that farms are one of the top 5 climate mitigations. If we can manage our farms in the most effective way, that's a real solution to not just the climate crisis, but the crisis of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse and so on. And what you're doing here in relation particularly to climate is putting that into practice and demonstrating it.
I think it even goes one step further, which a lot of people have missed, is that farms could be part of the future power plants of New Zealand. So when we went on our tour just before, you saw my new 100 kilowatt solar array going in. We talked about the financial figures behind that and how the ROI on that was just remarkable, how significant that is. I have the ability to generate electricity, store electricity, and push it back into the grid at the right moment in time when the rest of New Zealand needs it. So I am one of 50,000 farms that could be doing that could keep the electricity prices low for New Zealand. Low-cost, clean energy is the future of this economy. And farmers play such a significant role in that, but we often only think about that pie chart that we have, which is the riparian plantings, the removal of fossil fuels from our farm. We don't hypothecate the benefit to the rest of New Zealand, and I think that's a real narrative farmers can take forward. It's rather than being like, we produce the majority of New Zealand's emissions or agricultural emissions, rather than that narrative, which makes us look really bad, we instead are making really cheap renewable energy for the rest of New Zealand to help them decarbonise, and that is just a far more positive narrative that gets everyone on the same page. At the end of the day, we've got to do both our fossil fuel emissions and our agricultural emissions. The fossil fuel emissions are the low-hanging fruit, and I'm an orchardist and I love low-hanging fruit.
Of course you do. And that's obviously a great segue to talking a bit now about Rewiring Aotearoa. And I think listeners will understand from what you've said already how you have got really interested in the energy system. But tell us a bit more what you're trying to achieve through that initiative and what you're doing.
Yeah, so Rewiring Aotearoa was basically formed by a group of New Zealanders when a chap by the name of Dr. Saul Griffith came over for a conference. It's essentially modelled off the great work that's been done by Rewiring Australia, and the bigger one, of course, is Rewiring America, who were formed after the Inflation Reduction Act essentially got passed. That was largely written, structured by many of the people that formed Rewiring America. So a bunch of people formed Rewiring Aotearoa. By that point, I was jumping up and down as the eclectic electric cherry orchardist from Central Otago going, why are we not talking about this? Why are we not talking about solar generation, battery storage, and the electrification of all our small machines? Because it just makes sense. And that group of people invited me to become the CE of Rewiring Aotearoa. And then after becoming the CE of Rewiring Aotearoa, we went out to a bunch of New Zealand-based philanthropists and basically raised some money to fund our team to achieve what I think is a very, very ambitious but totally achievable goal now, which is to electrify 10 million fossil fuel machines in New Zealand by 2030. And that is everything from the chain snores and the whippersnippers through to light tractors, light trucks, that kind of thing. Putting New Zealand on the right adoption curves, that this is just an inevitable outcome now. And if we can achieve that, well, we're well on track to being the world's first fully electric economy by 2040.
And you've talked already, I think, about your kind of vision for electrifying farms. Be interested to explore that more perhaps in a few minutes. But one of the initiatives of Rewiring Aotearoa is very much focused on people's homes and that domestic market, if you could call it that. What's your vision there?
So we call them dinner table decisions. Dinner table decisions versus boardroom table decisions. And farmers sit somewhere in the middle there, right? And small businesses sit somewhere in the middle because a lot of the time the boardroom is the dinner table. But really it is around, first of all, the dinner table decisions. So 14% of New Zealand's gross emissions are created by machines where their fate will be decided around the dinner table. That is the cars that exist in your home, that is the way that you heat your home, the way that you cook your food, the way that you heat your water, the way that you generate or don't generate electricity, and the way that you store or don't store electricity. So those are the 6 machines, and that makes up 14% of our gross emissions in New Zealand, which is quite remarkable because up until this point we have categorized our emissions in a really unhuman way. We've said, okay, well, cars are part of transport. And then household really just comes down to water heaters and spatial heating and cooktops. And then energy is different again, and electricity is a different sector again, and so solar panels are different. And so by grouping these into more human decisions, right, dinner table decisions, you realise that the average family in New Zealand will have a remarkable impact on our gross emissions, 14% right there. And so that is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit, is the small machines that exist in the home. So a big part of that is education. A big part of that is changing the system to better reward people who are generating and storing electricity and contributing back to the grid. And a big part of that is fixing the finance so that everyone in New Zealand, doesn't matter if you're renting, doesn't matter if you're a landlord, doesn't matter if you're a homeowner, doesn't matter if you're elderly, there is the economic advantage from you replacing those machines with electric machines. The first thing is, when a machine breaks, make sure it's electric. But the second thing is then to do the numbers to see if it's worthwhile retiring some of those machines early, which in most cases now it is. So that's the big thing. Working on the households. Households spill over very, very quickly into farms and small businesses of New Zealand. And if you add up all of and this is a very big estimate, Rewiring Aotearoa isn't actually in the process of counting all the fossil fuel machines in New Zealand because we don't actually know how many machines there are. But if we look at an estimate of all the small machines in New Zealand where technology is available right now to replace them, and not only is technology available right now to replace them, but the ownership of an electric machine over its lifetime is now cheaper than the ownership of the fossil fuel machine, that's about 25% of New Zealand's gross emissions, right? And so if you look at that, you're like, wow, let's sequence these emissions and go after the stuff that's the win-win now, and that gives us enough time to sort out the harder, higher hanging fruit. And so that's really what rewiring is all about.
And one of the barriers a lot of people come across in relation to electrifying is that the capital cost of electric versions of equipment can often be more expensive to purchase in the first place than their fossil fuel equivalent. And an example that's often talked about is EVs being much more expensive to buy, and organising a structure for finance that enables people to overcome that barrier obviously would be really useful. Can you give us a sense of how the numbers stack up?
Yeah, I think when we're looking at electrification, it's quite common that the electric machine has a more expensive upfront capital cost than the fossil fuel machine. If we look at cars as an example, and we look at just energy first of all, the average driver in New Zealand drives about 11,000 kilometres a year. And when you include all road user charges or petrol excise tax, whatever it might be, plus all of the vehicle servicing, plus all of the energy costs, petrol vehicle, you're looking at about 39 cents per kilometre at the moment. And in an electric vehicle, it's charged at home, so not at one of the destination fast chargers, but it's charged at home, is about 20 cents per kilometre. And so operationally, you can see it's a lot cheaper to run an electric version than a fossil fuel version of a car. But the issue is the upfront capital cost. But here's where it gets really interesting, is what if you take the upfront capital cost and spread it over the lifetime of the machine? So essentially the lifetime of the car, 11,000 Ks a year times roughly 15 years is what we expect a car to last on the roads in New Zealand for. Well, then a petrol car costs 62 cents per kilometre it travels, and an electric vehicle costs 55 cents per kilometre it travels. So the upfront cost is higher, but the cost of ownership is considerably lower. And that equation gets better and better the more Ks you drive. So when you think about being a rural New Zealander, we drive significantly more than the 11,000 kilometres per year that the average New Zealander drives. In fact, using my own family and my life as an example, last year we did 35,000 kilometres of travel in our EVs. And so that number gets significantly cheaper the more Ks you drive.
And I can verify that 35,000 kilometres in the sense that we live in a rural location and do about 30 to 35,000 kilometres a year in our EV.
There you go. So it kind of it proves the point as well that when we talk about the average home in New Zealand, we're talking about a suburban home in a temperate climate with 2 adults and 2 children, whereas every home is different, and that's why it's really important you have to do the numbers yourselves. But one of the things I keep going back to is, a lot of farmers will come to our farm, and one of the things that they'll come with a very sincere belief that electric vehicles are great in the city, but they're not great in the countryside, and actually, economically, they couldn't be further from the truth.
And is that one of the reasons why you talk about us being at this kind of tipping point with electrification?
Correct, exactly right. Like, we are almost at the point now where you are never better off buying a fossil fuel machine, right? That the caveats to that are maybe the electric machine isn't available yet, like a large tractor or a large truck, or the caveat to that might be that you actually don't use the fossil fuel machine enough that the fossil fuel bill is less than the interest bill. But for the average utilisation of machines in New Zealand, it's 100% better off electrifying it.
So I can almost hear some listeners saying, this is all very well, Mike, let's electrify everything. Where's all that electricity going to come from? Aren't we going to have to invest billions in upgrading the network in order to distribute this power? Aren't we just creating another problem for ourselves? What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, the short answer there is yes, we are going to need to invest in infrastructure. But I think the thing that's often missed, because the customer has never ever been treated as part of that infrastructure before, because we've only ever been able to take electricity. With the new technology that's available now, we are in such an interesting time where it is actually cheaper for you to generate your own electricity and store your own electricity than it is to buy it from the grid. And to give you some numbers for a household, for example, so this is including a finance rate of 5.5%. If you take the total capital cost of a solar setup and spread that over its expected lifetime of 25 years and the inverters over an expected lifetime of, say, 10 years, you're looking at 11.5 cents per kilowatt hour is what you can generate electricity at, which is interesting because the average price you can buy it from the grid for when you include all the line charges, the utility charges for basically building the poles and wires, is 34 cents a kilowatt hour. So solar on a rooftop in New Zealand is now financed on your mortgage is now a third of the price of grid electricity. Right, and when you put it in a battery, it gets even more interesting. So a battery, I think, is sitting at about 26 cents, or 28 cents, sorry, including the cost of finance to cycle a battery, which means putting all the solar energy that you generate into a battery and then using it later is still a little bit more expensive than the grid. But you have to remember that a lot of the solar that you generate immediately goes into appliances that are running in your home, even when you're not at home. Maybe it's into the fridge, maybe it's into the washing machine, definitely into the hot water. And so when that sort of happens and you look at what the average home in New Zealand should be able to achieve, without a heavy amount of involvement from the household, is about 50% of the solar that you generate you use immediately and 50% you store in a battery. And that is now cheaper than grid electricity, which is quite a remarkable situation that we find ourselves in. I can't actually remember the original question there, but I love to rant about that.
Yeah, no, you have answered the original question, which was about the resilience of our grid, the need to invest in that infrastructure.
Yes. So the short answer is that there are 2 million households in New Zealand, and if 80 of them did what's in their financial best interest, which is literally an economic slam dunk, which is solar and batteries now, they'll generate about 40% extra electricity. A lot of that will be used themselves, but the rest of it could, flow out into our national grid. If the 50,000 farms in New Zealand did what I did on my farm, which is a reasonably modest solar installation that you've now seen, that's another 60% electricity generation. So between the households and the farms of New Zealand, we could double the amount of renewable electricity on the grid right there. And that's not then considering all of the new generation that's being, fast-tracked through the government and all those kinds of things at the moment. That could potentially add a lot more. And I think the key thing in all of this is that if we're to electrify our entire economy, we're probably going to need, to double the amount of electricity on the grid. We don't need 100% renewable electricity. We need 200% renewable electricity. But then if you look at the future, which is probably going to include, land use change or economy change, which is going to require different energy requirements. And I think one of those biggest ones that we're looking at is the potential for data centers in New Zealand, especially for the growth of AI. Then you're probably going to need closer to a 300% renewable grid, right? And so the answer is we need all of everything. But the dream is that if we can do this in households, there is going to be a need for an increase in the poles and wires, but how do we also put downward pressure on the cost of delivered energy to the household? And I think that's something that's totally achievable, one, through households generating it themselves, but also changing the energy system to allow households to better share that energy within their communities. And we could very easily end up with significantly reduced household energy bills.
One of the dimensions of all of this that I'm really interested in is giving people energy sovereignty, giving people, communities a bit more kind of power over their power. Have you got any views on that?
I think energy sovereignty is going to be a major topic moving forward in the future. We are seeing the price of energy continue to rise. That's both fossil fuels as well as electricity from the grid. And one thing we have to remember when we're talking about our power bills is that we're not just paying for the electricity that gets generated at one of the dams or the wind farms or a centralised solar farm or indeed the coal power plant at Huntly. We're also paying for all the poles and wires that connect our homes to those power plants. And the most amazing thing about solar technology, solar on our own rooftops, is there's no delivered energy cost. You do have to pay an upfront capital cost, but when you buy solar panels, you're now locking in the price of power at 6.8 cents a kilowatt hour or 11.5 cents if you're financing it on your mortgage, and you're locking it in for the next 20, 25 years. So from that perspective, there is no opportunity for people to get into the middle of this and clip the ticket. The energy from your rooftop is being used straight away by the appliances in your home, or stored in the battery, or stored in the hot water cylinder, or stored in the EV. And that is just such an exciting opportunity for households, because it takes, excuse the pun, takes the power back and makes it a lot more balanced in an energy world that I think has, largely lost its social license by continuing to increase prices without necessarily offering a better service.
So another slightly curly question. Many people will think, okay, great, let's electrify, but don't we just need to use less energy overall?
So that's the efficiency thing. And so Rewiring's mantra is, how do we continue with the lifestyles, especially in the household, that we're comfortable with, without needing to change too much, but actually just decarbonising those households? And the simple answer is that the efficiency gains from electrifying everything is absolutely significant. So we kind of get the energy efficiency we're looking for just by swapping out fossil fuels and moving to electricity. If you ever look at, say, a litre of diesel as an example, it has about 10 kilowatt hours worth of energy in it. And the most important thing to understand is that about under 20% of that energy will be used to propel that vehicle forward. The rest of that energy is wasted heat, vibrations, and noise, which is just remarkable when you think about it. On the other hand, electric vehicles 80 to 90% efficiency, right? And so just the sheer amount of energy that you actually need to use to do the same job is significantly less. And that's what we're noticing out here on the farm as well, is that, our tractor, it costs $2 an hour to run rather than probably $14 an hour to run in energy costs. But a large amount of that is due to the efficiency of electrification. So electrification, we will use far less energy. We'll also stop, shipping containers or tankers coming from the other side of the world. So all of those upstream energy use and emissions will also begin to disappear. We will use far less energy overall. But I think one of the things that the climate movement has always one of the mistakes we've made in the past is we've talked about a culture of sacrifice. You need to sacrifice everything in the name of the climate. And we've stalled, and we haven't really won the majority of the population over with that narrative. Even though, there is some merit to that narrative that consuming less is a good idea, for all sorts of reasons, right now we've got to figure out how to reduce emissions very, very quickly, which means getting the majority of New Zealand on board to reducing these emissions. And that's where I see electrification as a key path forward. And actually electrification, I've seen on this farm, that leads to a lot of behaviour change as well, because all of a sudden the way that you use your machines is different, which leads to also less energy use overall.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of that question of consumption and reducing energy use and the kind of, you could almost call it sort of hair shirt mentality that some in the climate and wider environmental movement sometimes convey. The thing is, there's a point of sufficiency where you have a comfortable lifestyle and you have a nice vehicle and the things you need. And then there's a point beyond that where possibly modern marketing and advertising just encourages you to feel that there's more and more stuff that you need that actually you don't really need. And there's a difference perhaps there between what's required for a comfortable, enjoyable, prosperous, fulfilling life and the pressure we are sometimes put under, particularly in the advanced economies, to consume more.
One of the things we often overlook is the average driver in New Zealand will put 50 kilos of organic matter into their vehicles every week, right? And because it goes into the pump, from the pump into the hole that takes the petrol, you don't see that volume. You have to know you bought 50 litres of diesel and that cost you $100 and something, but you don't see that volume. And then what does the engine do when it consumes that? It combusts it and then spreads that out as a waste product, which is CO2. And CO2 is then spread evenly throughout the atmosphere. It's invisible, and we don't think about it as waste, even though it is a byproduct of a process, right? An unwanted byproduct of a process. So CO2 is the biggest waste problem that we have. And by getting rid of fossil fuels, your consumption immediately plummets. And so I think the two together, if we can address those as the low-hanging fruit, then the other consumption can be addressed next. But that just seems to be the biggest opportunity in front of us, where we don't have to convince people to massively change their behaviours in order to start decarbonising New Zealand really quickly and just making it more efficient.
Thank you, yes. So how can people find out more and potentially get involved in your Rewiring Aotearoa initiative?
Yes, so rewiring.nz is our website. There's a lot of content up there about what it is that we're doing. We're trying to celebrate electrification around New Zealand. So last week we were up filming at Waste Management, who now have 50 electric waste trucks they've converted themselves. We were filming it at Auckland Transport around the 179 electric buses they have, which is the largest electric bus fleet in the Southern Hemisphere. We're regularly going to people's small businesses like the fully electric solar-powered cafe in Geraldine that runs records, which is pretty cool, called Record Keeper. We're out there celebrating the first electric commercial foiling boat, which is about to launch in Auckland through a company called Vesiv. We're there celebrating the electric ferry in Wellington, the electric jet boat through Shot Over Jet. All of those kinds of things are really, really important. So that's what rewiring is about doing, is sort of making people aware that these machines actually exist and breaking down a lot of those myths that electric technology isn't available to do that stuff, because indeed it actually is. So that's one of the things. But I think the bigger thing now is that what we've seen happen in Australia is lots of individual postcode electrification groups spawn. And those electrification groups are there to help other people within their communities go down the path of electrification, to try and encourage those particular communities to fully electrify and be one of the first in Australia to do that. We had Electrify Queenstown a couple of weeks ago, which is an amazing event that was put on by the Business Chamber and Destination Queenstown. Michaela, if you're listening to that, that was just an absolutely amazing job, well done. And to the whole team there, just an absolute significant impact on the discussion and the dialogue in Queenstown around electrification. I'm really excited about the guys from Sustainable Wairarapa who are now setting up Electrify the Wairarapa, which is an event we're hoping to get off the ground in November. And really, we just need these all over the country. Because as I said, like, people come to my farm and they're already curious. They're all curious. And having that peer support there to electrify the whole of New Zealand fast is super important. So really what Rewiring is now interested in doing is finding those electrification superheroes all over New Zealand that can focus on their postcodes, form groups, or run inside an existing sustainable charity that might already be running in that region, and just figure out how to get us on the right adoption curves to electrify 10 million fossil fuel machines by 2030.
And maybe when Melissa and I have taken delivery of our electrically converted Kubota, it's a small tractor on a lifestyle block, but maybe somebody from Rewiring Aotearoa would be interested in coming.
Oh, absolutely. I've still got to go out there and next time I'm in Christchurch, go out and interview Duncan. Definitely. When are you taking possession of that?
Hopefully the beginning of September.
Great.
No pressure, Duncan.
Great. Well, I'm definitely up in Christchurch at least once in September, so hopefully I can roll by your place and we can do some filming of you mowing your lifestyle block with your new tractor. That'd be cool.
That'd be awesome. Well, you'd always be welcome. Which is, again, this is a lovely segue to a slightly more kind of personal rounding up of the podcast. And I think I and listeners will have an understanding of your passion and what you're doing in your both your work and your personal life to try and make a difference and demonstrate how people can make a difference themselves. Have you got a particular book or a podcast or a resource of that nature that you would point people to as something that's been meaningful to you and you think would be helpful to others?
There have been a couple of resources that I have been interested in, but I largely carved the initial part of my journey myself because there wasn't a lot of people that were out there writing about the electrification of all the small machines. It was when Rewiring Aotearoa formed that I read Saul Griffith's book, The Big Switch, which I thoroughly recommend anyone has a read of. It's a fun, not too heavy book about the electrification of Australia and what needs to happen. So it does come with an Australian lens. But my long-term goal is we need to figure out how to write the New Zealand version of The Big Switch. And that's going to involve talking to a lot of people such as yourself and all the electrification superheroes that I spoke about before. My cherry farm is just one of the many businesses that are active in this space. The other book that I really like is a book called Climate Capitalism, which is all about how it is that we can reduce our emissions while also, in a capitalistic society. And I know that some of your listeners might cringe at that, but the reality is we don't have a lot of time before 2030 to electrify a bunch of stuff. So let's figure out what we can do now while we figure out the greater systems change as we go. So those are probably the two books. And I know what will happen as soon as you leave. I would have thought of another resource, but those would be the two I can think of right off the top of my head.
Well, they sound great. And on that issue of making this progress we need to by 2030, what would your one tip for a listener be in terms of something they could do in their own lives?
I think the next time a fossil fuel machine breaks, really do the numbers on electrification. That would be my first tip. The second one would be actually, if you're active in the space and want to do something sooner than when a machine breaks, well, then actually start doing the numbers now. You know that a gas boiler is going to last on average 15 years. How old's your gas boiler now? Is it at the point now where it's 3 or 4 years away from probably needing to be replaced anyway? And if so, what are the extra additional costs of replacing it early? And you'll probably find right there and then that it's a cheaper option to electrify. So that would probably be my number one tip. My number two tip would be, if you're looking for greenfield stuff, the solar on your roof is an economic slam dunk now. And as soon as you put solar on your roof, you learn what a kilowatt hour is. A kilowatt hour is just like a kilometre or a kilogram. It's just a unit of measurement, but it's really hard to contextualise until you understand that that school is 10k away and that you weigh 80 kilos, for example, you can't contextualize it. Well, as soon as you've got solar on the roof, you can contextualize what a kilowatt hour of electricity is. And you can really start to sort of, make it efficient. I think the solar and batteries, but in particular solar, is really the gateway drug to electrification, because once you've got it on your roof, there's a massive amount of cognitive dissonance about the electricity that you're generating and not using. And when you're cooking on your gas hob, or running a shower with gas hot water, you're like, actually, I could be powering this with my solar. And likewise with cars as well. The moment that you're generating your own solar, you'll notice how often your car's parked at home during the solar window. When you think about it that way, the average EV probably has 400 k's worth of range on it now, and the average driver in New Zealand drives 230 kilometres a week. It's always going to be home at some point during the solar window, on the weekend or wherever it is, and that's the perfect opportunity to charge that car. And so you start to think about these things, and you just sort of realise how inefficient our current energy system is, and even how inefficient the energy system in your own household is. And so that would be my number one piece of advice, is just replace those machines, or maybe put solar on the roof first and see how you go.
Great advice. Thank you very much indeed. And my final question, if you had a superpower to make the world a better place, to guarantee prosperity for future generations, what would that superpower be?
I would have an electrification finger, where I could just point at a machine and it would just immediately be electric. That would be a real superpower, because the one unfortunate thing about a machine is you can't just swap out its energy source. And so a lot of the time we look at our pie charts on an annual basis and we go, it's only a small amount of our emissions, but actually that machine could exist for 15 years, which actually means it's 15 years of emissions. And buying a new fossil fuel machine is 15 years of committed emissions. And it's really significant, those emissions, when you look at it that way, over the lifetime use or ownership of a machine. An electrification finger, I think, would just be absolutely the most important superpower anyone in the world could have right now.
Every guest on this podcast series has had a very different kind of superpower aspiration. I think yours is probably the most immediately practical one. So thanks for sharing that. And I mean, look, it's been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it. There are so many different avenues we could have gone down, and perhaps we'll record another podcast sometime. So thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much, Roger. And any of your listeners out there that want to get involved in rewiring in those communities, reach out.
So have you given me cause for optimism? You certainly have, seeing what you're doing here, both on the orchard directly and then in the smart energy system that you're developing and contributing in your work with Rewiring Aotearoa. Have you issued a call for action? You certainly have, and your reference to solar on the roof being the gateway drug to electrification, I can so identify with everything you said there, so thank you for that. And for listeners out there, thanks for listening to this episode of my podcast series. I really hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as I've enjoyed being part of it. If you're interested in more conversations about people, planet and food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review the show. And of course, share it with other people you think might be interested. If you've got any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to get in touch with me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz, and especially if you know of interesting people working in this space that you think I should interview. So with that, I will close out this podcast and thank Mike for the work that he's doing to create a fairer, more resilient, more environmentally friendly food system and energy system, and look forward to recording the next podcast in the near future. Until then, mā te wā, see you next time.
Kia kite.